The Causes of the American War for Independence by Matthew Doyle. Today, we will be looking at three main points of interest as it relates to the Revolutionary War. We will be justifying the British and how they imposed new taxes and restrictions on the colonies at the beginning of the 1760s. We will be analyzing the reactions of the British policies by the colonists. And we'll be going over, reviewing, and evaluating the legitimacy of the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and the colonial reactions of all the policies put in place by the British government. The cause of conflict between France and Great Britain was the fertile Ohio River Valley, which was claimed by both countries but was largely unsettled according to the population statistics at the time. The French built Fort Duquesne as a way to discourage English settlers from the area, and if the English wanted to colonize the area, they would need to send and support overseas troops, which would put them in more debt. British Governor of Virginia, Robert Doyle, sent troops to the land owned by the Ohio Company to evict the French. Though the English initially defeated the small group of French soldiers, they were forced to surrender when the French counterattacked. These events sparked a 9-year war that would result in a British victory in the North America front. The British had successfully ridded America of all French troops, leaving only Spanish in the west of the Mississippi. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, in which the treaty stated that France would get the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, and England would get all land, including North Canada. This agreement may not seem as fair, as North Canada did not possess many natural resources worth value, whereas the Sugar Islands brought great wealth to Spain. It contributed to the American Revolution as the war forced colonial enlistment and the carrying of British troops as they stayed in the towns. The war left Britain's budget drained, leading towards the colonists to start paying taxes to support the British Empire. Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation of 1763 pertained to when Native Americans saw that the French loss of the war meant that they could no longer play the French against the English. The tribes of the Mississauga, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Ahome, Wyandot, Miami, Kickapoo, Massasoit, Delaware, Shawnee, and Seneca Native Americans organized the capturing of a British fort, which was successful in 1763. The uprising would later be called Pontiac's Rebellion, after the Ottawa chief. The Native Americans tried to then lure the French back by weakening the British, but failed in conquering 3 pivotal forts. After running out of supplies that they originally received from British gifts during the war, the rebellion quickly fizzled out and died. It contributed to causing the American Revolution, as afterwards the Proclamation of 1763 stated that all settlers were to remain east of the Appalachian Mountains. Few colonists respected this proclamation, which acted as a direct violation of an act of Parliament. This can also be referred to as salutary neglect. This caused anger by the colonists who realized if they had to fight to achieve nothing, what was the point of having to pay taxes to support the funds of the British government? In an attempt to recuperate from the massive debts accumulated from the war, Britain enacted the Grenville Acts. These were taxations against the colonists that include the Stamp Act, which required all colonists to pay taxes on printed products such as newspapers, books, court documents, contracts, and land deeds, and acted as the first directly imposed tax on the colonies by Parliament. The Stamp Act raised large opposition in the colonies because they wanted the right to tax themselves and create their own documents with their own officials. A second act came into play was the Sugar Act, which raised tax on molasses and all sugar that came from the West Indies. It contributed to causing the American Revolution as the idea of taxation without representation. The colonists felt that they were not receiving the full rights of British citizens, and if they should be paying taxes, they should be given the right to vote, create their own laws, and run their own government. These restrictions caused more problems. The Stamp Act provided the necessary push to create the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. They were a group dedicated to repealing certain laws that they found unjust imposed upon them by the British government. They went against these laws by leading protests, destroying government buildings and official homes, boycotting goods, protesting new taxes, and rallying people for protests against the British government in massive displays in open areas. The Daughters of Liberty went against the British government by boycotting their own British goods, including tea, and expressing their own anti-British ideas. It contributed to causing the American Revolution, as the violence against tax collectors caused the sending of military troops for the protection of them and government officials. These acts of denial prompted Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Charles Townshend, the Crown's chief financial officer, thought that the colonists would accept indirect taxes rather than direct taxes on commerce. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which levied new imported duties on everyday items such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Soldiers present in Boston took many of the people's jobs and earned money, which created tension among the common people and the soldiers. One night, the soldiers accused John Hancock and his ship, the Liberty, of smuggling tea into the colonies. This came out to be true, and he was arrested. In response to the Townshend Acts, protests erupted. One night in March 1770, a group of colonists hurled snowballs and rocks at British soldiers guarding the customs house. One soldier was hit and resulted in a small quarrel and one of the soldiers accidentally firing. The nervous soldiers then began to sporadically fire into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. It is considered a massacre because of all the propaganda made by the colonists to create an opinion of anti-British, pro-American nationalism. The dead included Christmas attacks, a sailor who has been an escaped slave of mixed Indian and African ancestry. Under the leadership of Samuel Adams, papers called the killings the Boston Massacre. Adams then continued to organize committees of correspondence to go against what had happened. Britain took this as a serious threat and removed all troops, but to maintain control in the area and show that they're still in charge, they maintained the tea tax. This contributed to the American Revolution as it caused tensions to rise between Britain and America as the first official deaths and fighting had now occurred. The tea boycott worsened financial problems for the already struggling British East India Company. To help the company and encourage the colonists to pay the tax, Parliament passed a law allowing the company to sell directly to the colonists. This made their tea cheaper than the smuggled tea, even with the tax, thus creating a monopoly in which the colonists who smuggled Dutch tea could not compete. Instead of buying the cheaper tea, the colonists protested that the British were trying to trick them into just paying the tax. If the East India Company sold tea directly, it would also hurt the wealthy colonists who were benefiting from smuggling tea in the lucrative trade business. On the night of December 16, 1773, Boston patriots took matters into their own hands. They dressed themselves up as Indians and put paint on their face and boarded 3 British ships and dumped the tea into the harbor. Today, that may not seem like much, but they dumped an equivalent of $4 million worth of tea, which severely crippled the already suffering British East India Company. It contributed to causing the American Revolution, as it showed further disobedience and acts of sabotage against Britain, and directly disobeying the king. The Bostonians' actions outraged Parliament and the Crown. To punish Boston, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. They closed the port of Boston Harbor to trade until the inhabitants paid for the destroyed tea, including all the taxes that would have been accumulated with it. but in an area that relied so heavily upon the trade by sea, lost money and struggled to pay back the tax. They also increased the power of the governor at the expense of the elected assembly in the town. To enforce these measures, the British sent warships and troops to Boston. The colonists were outraged. In addition to closing the port, the acts forced colonists to house British troops and allow British officials to be tried in Britain for crimes committed in the colonies. They also banned town hall meetings, which was the main form of Boston government. In addition, the Quebec Act extended Canada's southern border, cutting off lands claimed by several colonies. The horrified colonists called the new laws the Intolerable Acts. In the fall of 1774, delegates from every colony except for Georgia met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for the First Continental Congress. The goal was to remove the coercive acts, but not to separate from Britain. The idea had not come up at the time. Virginia's delegates included the Patrick Henry, who became famous for declaring the statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." He elected the New England delegates by declaring, "The distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." The Suffolk Resolves in 1774 included leaders proposing a rejection of British imports in the Coercive Act. They also, by doing this in meeting here, proposing these things, were going against the town hall ban. To pressure Parliament to withdraw the coercive acts, the delegates announced a boycott of all British imports, including the East India Company. Throughout the colonies, patriots established local committees and provincial congresses to enforce the boycotts. In effect, the patriots established new governments that bypassed Parliament entirely and the Crown. By including common shopkeepers, artisans, and farmers, and the committees expanded the ranks of political activity. The idea to set up militia also came up in these meetings, in which a small army was to be formed. This small army came as a threat to Britain, as they saw the colonies preparing for war. This contributed to causing the American Revolution, as even though the intentions of independence were just beginning to form at the time, it sparked a form of nationalism throughout the Americas that caused defensive militia to grow rapidly, that would lead to conflicts later on. Early 1775, following the Coercive Acts, military commander General Thomas Gage had been named governor of Massachusetts. Then John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and other colonial leaders came together to create a provincial congress to govern Massachusetts without Gage. They also began to stockpile arms and ammunition. The Battle of Lexington and Concord came on April 19, 1775, when war erupted in two towns west of Boston. Gage provoked the battles by sending troops to arrest Hancock and Adams in Lexington and seize their Patriot weapons stockpiled in Concord. Tipped off by men including Paul Revere, who had ridden into the countryside to warn of approaching British troops, the local patriots rallied to drive the troops back to Boston. The patriot fighters were militia who were made up of full-time farmers and only lightly trained soldiers. In total, around 70 patriots had gathered on the Lexington Green as British soldiers called redcoats, due to their bright red uniforms, marched into the lawn at dawn. The British commander ordered his militia to disperse. As they did, someone fired a shot. When the shooting stopped, 8 patriots were dead. The redcoats marched on to Concord, only to find that all the weapons had been removed, and that the people they were searching for were long gone. As the British troops began their march back to Boston, hundreds of Minutemen, or Patriot militia, earned their name by their ability to respond quickly to the calls for soldiers. They lined the roofs and roads of the paths leading back to Boston and began to fire at the British behind trees, stone walls, and whatever cover they could find. The Patriots killed or wounded more than 200 British soldiers, and leaving them stunned and exhausted, the British reached the safety of Boston in the late afternoon. From throughout New England, thousands of Patriot men rushed to confine the British troops in the city. Provincial assemblies of patriots seized control of New England colonies. Loyalistic colonists who remained loyal to the British throne fled to take refuge in Boston. This contributed to the American Revolution, as it was the first real battle between the colonies and Britain, and it showed that the Americans were willing to fight and die for this cause. It's May 1775. Delegates from all colonies assembled in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, which formed to get unity after the colonial battles of Lexington and Concord. This meeting would serve as the first American government. Congress assumed responsibility for the war effort in running the country. They took on the tasks of establishing an army, conducting foreign affairs, printing money, which ultimately did cause inflation but helped to pay for the debts that many farmers owned. Armed volunteers from the middle and southern colonies marched north to join the Patriot siege of Boston. Congress gave the command of the new Continental Army to George Washington. Washington had served as a colonial officer in the French and Indian War, and he came to Virginia, the largest and most powerful colony. New England needed Virginia's help to win the war. Some radical members of the Continental Congress wanted to declare America independent from Britain, but they recognized that most of the people were not ready to do so. Most colonists still hoped to remain within the British Empire, but wanted to not pay taxes to Parliament. In July 1775, after 3 months of bloodshed, Congress sent an olive branch petition to King George III. The petition reaffirmed the colonists' allegiance to the king, but not Parliament. The king rejected the petition and sent more troops to Boston. Thomas Paine wrote a radical book called Common Sense, in which he used his forceful and direct language to propose a radical course of action for the colonies, independence from Britain, in which republic state governments and a union of new states would be created. In the spring of 1776, Paine's ideas had built momentum for the American independence movement. Knowing the shift in public opinion, Congress selected a committee to draft a document declaring America's independence and explaining the reasons for it. On July 2nd, Congress voted that America was free. 2 days later, they approved the Declaration of Independence. It was proposed by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who was from a wealthy family in one of the most prestigious colonies. Thus, he had his name to back up his claims for the statements. It was drafted by Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration drew upon Paine's ideas to denounce the king as a tyrant who made America independency necessary. Although primarily a long list of colonial grievances, the Declaration also advanced the bold idea that all men are created equal. Congress embraced these ideas with those of the Enlightenment. They believe that all men are born with natural rights and those that cannot be taken away by any government. Jefferson called these the unalienable rights. John Hancock was president of the Second Continental Congress, making him the most important signature on the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was the one who wrote the document himself. During this time, there was a lot of high tensions, so people would often make jokes during it to break the silence. One of those jokes came from John Hancock, in which he signed his signature large, stating that King George should be able to read this without his glasses. That kind of humor is what shows that there was some humanity in the situation. The Declaration of Independence is made up of 4 parts. The preamble, which explains the purpose of the document. The Declaration of Natural Rights, which are derived from John Locke's ideas, in which all rights are given by God. As a way to protect the rights, we create governments, which create laws, and we are loyal to those governments. If in any case these rights are not protected with these laws, the people have the right to overthrow that government and create a new one. The third is the Bill of Indictment, which explains how Britain violated their natural rights. It was written to accuse King George III and those precursor of all their infringements of their natural rights as humans and citizens of Britain. The fourth is the Statement of Independence. Just as John Locke proposed, because Britain, or specifically King George, violated those rights, the United States, as colonies, are free to rebel and break away. And by doing so, they gain all the rights of a free, independent country. And they did this so that the audience, being the world, would be able to see their power and what they stood for, and possibly make new allies by doing so. Some extra facts to keep in mind is that Congress did not officially adopt the document until July 4th, hence why we celebrate the 4th of July. Most people did not sign it, though, until August 2nd, and it was never signed by George Washington at the time, as he was off fighting and leading the war.